Hello, today we're going to continue our study on Galatians and we're going to be looking at Galatians chapter 3. I do encourage you to read it before we continue. So just in summary, in Galatians chapter 1 and 2, Paul had defended his status as an apostle, he had defended the message that he was preaching, and he had challenged the church in Galatia who were about to forsake the freedom that they had in Christ for the slavery of observing the law. And he had reminded them that no one can be saved by observing the law. If they could, then Christ came and died for nothing. Now, Paul could have finished there. He had said what he needed to say, but I think Paul was really passionate about this church and about this message, and he wanted to elaborate to drive the point home. He uses some very strong words as he continues. In verses 1 to 3 we read, "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed crucified. I would like to learn just one thing from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law, or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish? After beginning by means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by means of the flesh?" This year we have been under lots of rules and regulations, haven't we, because of the current pandemic. It can be stressful, it can be frustrating, it can be confusing. And it reminds me of the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament. I do encourage you to skim through Leviticus. It's a hard read. The children of Israel, the Israelites, when they left Egypt, were given lots and lots of rules and regulations. They were told how they needed to behave and what they needed to do in a variety of different situations. And it must have been very restrictive, very confusing and very stressful. And it was impossible for them to not only fulfill all those rules and regulations to the letter, but also it didn't change their heart at all. You know, it's difficult, isn't it, when you've got to observe lots of rules and regulations that are intricate. It's almost impossible to do that, and it's restrictive. And, you know, that's almost like what we're going through now. It's impossible to be perfect. When I'm having a lesson observation, when our team are having a lesson observation at work, we might get 9 things ticked off and be told that was really good. But then suddenly, you know, they'll mention one thing that we need to improve on, and that's the one thing I will be focusing on, that we were not perfect, and I'll be frustrated that one thing didn't go right. But it's actually impossible to be 100% perfect in anything. Mankind cannot keep the law to the letter. It is impossible. And the Galatians were choosing to get back into that way of living, of trying to be perfect, when they didn't need to. The grace of God had been offered to them, and they were exchanging faith for legalism. My first question to you is, why else might the Galatians have been tempted to get back into observing the law? Now we go on to a passage that talks about Abraham, and I'm going to try and summarize as best as I can. So Abraham is held up by Paul as the father of the Jewish faith. And indeed he was. He had a son called Isaac, and through that line came Jacob, the 12 sons of Jacob, and the Jewish faith, and Christ as well. And God had promised Abraham that he would become the father of many nations. His wife, Sarah, had Isaac when she was very elderly. She was in her 90s, and she'd never been able to have children before, but this was a promise to her. So by faith, the Jewish faith originated, which would eventually lead to the way of salvation by faith. But whilst he was waiting, Abraham decided to get into a bit of works, and he had a child with his wife's maidservant, the slave Hagar, and that didn't end up going very well. But what it's showing is that the only way forwards for salvation is by faith. Mankind cannot work it out themselves. That's not the way forwards. It has to be a miracle. It has to be by faith, by God's hand alone. And Sarah, in her 90s, having never had children, having a baby, was clearly by God's hand alone. Paul is saying that the Gentiles are already sons of Abraham by faith. They do not need to be circumcised. Abraham did not need to involve Hagar at all. Faith is enough. Question 2 is, in what areas of your life do you struggle to live by faith? Verse 23 reads, before this faith came, we were held prisoners by the law, locked up until faith should be revealed. Paul is now likening them to choosing to be basically in prison. They were prisoners to the law. They were constantly having to think about it and how they might live and behave in order to fulfill it. But they don't need to do this anymore. The grace of God has been magnified and revealed by the law. God saying it didn't matter just kind of showed how great his grace was. And I think Paul is that's why Paul's so incensed. They're choosing to be chained back up by these restrictive ways and by this impossible way of, I can be made perfect through the law. Verses 26 to 29 complete chapter 3, and we read, you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who were baptized with Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. We're going to elaborate a little bit more on this and read a little bit more into this in chapter 4. But for now, this was absolutely huge. In those days, women and slaves and non-Jews were looked down upon. They were seen as inadequate. They carried some heavy labels. And Paul is in effect saying that not only are these people now one in Christ and heirs of the faith, but they do not need to do anything extra. You can imagine the Jewish elite saying, well, okay, we accept that you are now allowed to be in our faith, but you still need to follow this rule and this regulation, and you still need to undergo this ritual. And Paul is saying, no, they do not. They don't have to add to that salvation. They have received it by faith. They are equal with you. That is it. And that was groundbreaking. And in those days, it's so tempting, isn't it, to label ourselves or each other in order to feel comfortable, in order to understand each other, to put each other in a box. But actually, God does not see anyone with a label. He does not put anyone in a box. He just looks at the person and the essence of who they are. There is, the label is a tool and nothing more. And all labels have now been thrown out, and there's no distinction. They're all equal. Our final question is, what labels have you given yourself or been given by others which have restricted you? Have a great rest of your day.